Okay. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you are in the world. It's evening here in Jerusalem. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. I'm welcoming, I think, a lot of people that are welcoming back a lot of regulars to these webinars, and also I think some newcomers. So it's good to have you with us on the latest of this series of webinars that the Begin Center is doing in collaboration with the Hidden Light Institute in the United States, an organization which, amongst other things, has produced the first feature-length documentary about the life of Menachem Begin in English. I'm happy to say that we have a date for the international premiere of that. That'll be on June the 7th. And but the day before that, on June the 6th, we're going to have a symposium, sadly a virtual symposium, based in cyberspace, but obviously open to all, and we'll publicize that nearer the time. We're already building up a really great list of speakers for that event. Okay, so what we've been doing in these webinars is looking at different issues, different topics, which in some way connect to the broader legacy of Menachem Begin and his beliefs in the fundamental importance of the security of the State of Israel and the Jewish people, in foreign policy, in peace, and also in, of course, how, and this is what we'll be looking at today to some extent, the way Israel is perceived around the world, and what implications that has for policy. We have an incredible panel for you, and that panel is going to be introduced by the gentleman that I'm about to introduce, Jonathan Wachtel. Jonathan Wachtel advises government leaders, chief officers, NGOs, entertainment and news organizations on policy communications and new media. He's a regular global affairs analyst on national and international radio and TV channels. He served as a senior policy advisor and director of communications for the US mission to the United Nations. He also handles media coordination with the National Security Council, the State Department, and the White House. He has nearly 30 years of experience as a multimedia journalist for ABC News, for Worldwide Television News and Fox News, coordinating coverage of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Darfur, the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Haiti earthquake, and presidential elections. He began his journalism career by establishing WTN's Moscow office in the Soviet Union. He was transferred to WTN's headquarters in London, where he handled senior newsroom positions and worked at the BBC on a project to integrate news gathering operations. He earned his BA in Slavic languages and literature at the University of California, Berkeley, and his master's in management of public and non-profit organizations at NYU Wagner School of Public Policy. He served on the board of the UN Correspondents Association. And before I hand over to him, I will say I'm going to return to do Q&A at the end of the presentation. You'll also be happy to know that I'm going to close the door in the room I'm in, and the trumpet player that you've been hearing during that introduction will not be audible. It is actually the security guard here at the Begin Center. Without further ado, I will pass over to Jonathan Wachtel. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Paul, and I didn't expect to be trumpeted in either, so that's wonderful. Thank you. We do have an interesting grouping here. We have a member of the Knesset, we have an active journalist, and we actually have a lawyer active journalist monitor with us today of such caliber that it's really wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. The member of Knesset is Michal Cotler-Wunsh, who is serving under the Knesset Blue and White Party. She's serving under the Blue and White Party. She, in her capacity as a member of Knesset, chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee, Defense, Law. She also has a very busy schedule looking after diaspora relations with Israel, something that I look forward to asking her about in terms of perceptions around the world of Israel. She also has a background, she earned her PhD following human rights, specifically focused on ethics, law, and politics, which she earned at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and also at the Freie Universität in Berlin. She actually grew up in Canada, though born in Israel, and graduated from McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And she also, in a matter that actually touches very close to my heart because I covered it as a journalist, managed working on the return of the deceased Israeli soldiers Hadar Golden and Aron Shaul, and is also involved in other Israeli civilians who have run into some of the horrors of what that conflict has brought us. We also have Matty Friedman, who is an active contributor to the New York Times op-ed section. He's also a prolific writer overall. He's penned a couple of books, a couple of nonfiction books that got great attention, most notably one that hit Amazon's 10 Best Books of the Year, A Soldier's Story of a Forgotten War. And he has had great accolades from book reviews from around the world, from the National Post, the Globe and Mail, Foreign Affairs, and other esteemed outlets. And he's written other books, the Aleppo Codex, which sounds intriguing as can be, about an ancient Bible manuscript. I look forward to reading that one day, Matty. Spies of No Country. For this particular discussion, I'm looking forward to asking him questions about a really important op-ed that he wrote that I read, I think it was maybe 6 or 7 years ago for The Atlantic, about news coverage and bias. And I do want to get into that with him. And he's covered extensively the various wars between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and most notably that Atlantic article that we'll get into. And I believe you also published in the tablet. And then our third panelist is Daniel Pomerantz, who is the CEO of Honest Reporting, which is a media watchdog that catches malign reporting that is so commonplace, unfortunately, in the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians and wider Israeli-Arab conflict. Daniel actually came into his role after working as an active lawyer, working for several high-profile law firms in New York and Chicago. But I guess he got that journalism bug, and it's something that could never leave him. You've probably seen him on occasion making appearances on I-24 News, ILTV News, and he also contributes to Newsweek and the Jerusalem Post, and teaches at Bar Ilan University School of Management, and lectures around the world on the very topic that we're going to be discussing today. I want to begin the conversation asking you, Matty, because I mentioned it earlier, and I really do suggest that everybody watching this read Matty's article at some point that was in The Atlantic, because I think it really lays out the issue quite succinctly. I worked in the Middle East as a journalist on both sides of the conflict. And much of what Matty writes in that article, and I'll give a little summary of one of the arguments that really struck me, is that journalists, when they show up, when they get parachuted into stories, they are clamoring so fast to try to get their bearings as to how to cover the story that they take the easy way out, and often will lean on NGOs, other journalists, and hearsay, and not do the digging that needs to happen to really get to the crux of what a story is about. And I want to ask you a little bit about that, Matty, and then I want to get a sense of your perspective on where things are now in terms of international coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But you wrote something specifically about the influence of NGOs on reporters. Can you explain what you were trying to relay?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to the folks at the Begin Center. I was a reporter for almost 6 years with the AP, the Associated Press, as you know, Jonathan, big American news agency. Left at the very end of 2011, and after the Gaza war in the summer of 2014, published 2 essays, one that you mentioned in The Atlantic and one for Tablet, both 2 parts of the same argument about what I'd seen as a journalist. I didn't go into international journalism expecting to be writing about journalism. But in the end, I think one of the most interesting things that I saw as a journalist was what happened inside the Bureau. In many ways, it was as interesting and as important as anything that I saw outside the Bureau, how opinions are formed, how stories are written, how close a news narrative is to a fictional narrative often. As to your question specifically, one of the main factors driving news coverage is, not just in this story, but I think in any international story, maybe in any story, is the social world in which the reporters operate. So you land in a country, as you know, because you've done it, you're pretty lost. If you're an international reporter, you don't speak a language, you don't really have your bearings. So you look for the people who are going to help you. Who's going to help you? The other reporters. And depending on where you are, international NGOs that are working on a given story. In Israel, the world of NGOs is enormous. There are hundreds or thousands of UN staffers, NGO staffers, people working for groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, people working for Israeli organizations that are often internationally funded, and everyone's going to be pushing information at you. They're going to be giving you reports in English, they're going to be calling you, you're going to have a lot of very easily available information. People are going to want to speak to you, they're going to want to meet with you, they're going to want to hang out with you, and that story will be very easy to write. It will literally be put on a plate and handed to you. So when you're a reporter coming in here, it's going to be very hard to resist that pre-existing narrative that has been cooked up for international consumption. And if you spend a couple of years here on this story and you're a smart, kind of observant journalist, you're going to realize that the story you're reporting doesn't actually explain events. But that takes a couple of years. And if you're only here for 2 or 3 years living in a social bubble that's basically expats and journalists and NGO people, you're going to be able to maintain that story without noticing how inaccurate it is. And then you're going to move on to some international posting, and you'll go off to misunderstand some other foreign story. That was my experience as an insider. Often people attribute kind of malevolence to reporters. Usually it's not malevolence. It is in some cases, but often it's what you mentioned. It's people scrambling to write a story that they don't understand.
Now, this scrambling has real implications because this is what the public understands internationally. Michal, I'm curious, when this comes back, it comes back like a boomerang, and you sitting on the Foreign Affairs Committee think, oh, crud, look at this. What am I going to do with this? Can you speak to some of the pain that you feel around this?
Yeah, I sure can. First of all, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to Daniel, to Matti, and to everybody that's here with us tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to engage in this very important discussion on such a timely topic. And I would just be remiss not to mark that yesterday was actually Menachem Begin's, well, it's the English date, but Yortzeit. So we, are really convening at a very particularly meaningful occasion, considering that the Begin Center is housing us. So thank you. Yes, it is extremely painful. And I'll say the following as an international lawyer and as somebody who comes into Knesset from both a research background, academic background, and also a public engagement background with the challenges that the state of Israel faces in the international arena, what's most frustrating, and Matti's words just corroborate it, is that essentially, the war waged on the state of Israel in the international arena, and I would, we could discuss the date, but I would at least argue that in Durban, the Durban Conference of 2001, there was a war waged on the state of Israel that actually is a strategy that's implemented very consistently, utilizing international institutions, NGOs, and the law. And in that war, we are basically in absentia. So the state of Israel is not in the ring. It's not there. It's simply not representing itself, utilizing the language of rights, the lingua franca spoken by all of those NGOs that are there on the ground, on the receiving end, whether it's to journalists or the public. And in fact, I'd say the war for the hearts and minds of the public and the war for public opinion And that's before we even enter the realm of social media platforms, which complicates matters even further, I believe, because, you know, the echo chamber and the siloed sort of effect that they have is actually graver. In that sense, around the committee table, I would say that the military purview, and it's singularly military, including the language that is utilized, is on one hand, you know, yes, Israel's advantage, and of course the resource we have. We've had no choice but to develop a very deep understanding of the military challenges that Israel has, but they create what gets lost in translation when we don't speak the language, and I do not mean English. The lingua franca spoken around the world in this war for public opinion is actually the language of rights. And in order to be able to rise from the docket of the accused, which the state of Israel has been sitting on, you know, and again, we can discuss since when, but certainly is sitting on currently. And we, you know, maybe we'll get to the ICC soon, because that's just one manifestation of this war waged against the state of Israel, utilizing international institutions. Having that voice in Knesset has been, on one hand, extremely rewarding. And again, you know, as part of the many committees that I've served on, I actually, for the first time, was appointed to be the envoy for all matters related to the ICC in Knesset. It's the first time that these issues are addressed inside Knesset, around the table of the Foreign Relations and Security or Defense Committee, because generally that committee, although it's called International Relations and Defense, focuses 95% on the time on defense. And in that committee, I say chutz ze bitachon. It's called chutz ve-bitachon. But in fact, we know that it's become an issue of actual, I would say, strategic, you know, importance for the state of Israel to understand these issues in order to identify the challenges and then expose them and address them, in particular when the law is utilized and, you know, sort of in a way that is neither equally distributed or singles out the state of Israel, as we know in the international institutions, whether it be the UN or the, you know, Human Rights Council and so forth, and the double standards that have to be identified and exposed in order to be able to address those challenges in that sort of public perception of Israel. And Matti's experience, or what he's described here, is one that actually resonates very deeply with the war that we are in fact engaged in very much in absentia.
Thank you for that. I do want to get into the ICC if we have time in this discussion, and certainly my old backyard, the United Nations. I had a question for you, Daniel. You know, you're on the front line of this issue too. What comes across your desk, and you know, anecdotally, I'd like to have you explain something that hit you just now, and explain for everybody here the speed at which you're combating bad information, misinformation out there. Give us a sense of what it's like for you on a daily basis, intercepting the barrage of strange stories out there, and how you deflect.
Well, first of all, I'll echo what Michal and Matti said. I feel so privileged to be a part of this really amazingly meaningful group here. I've been fans of all of you guys for years. I tell you what, the hardest part of my day is always when I read what's out there and feel that sense of angst that something was written in a way that's wrong. But then the best part of my day is when I start doing something about it, whether it's writing a critique that's really well thought out, or preparing a video that we put out on YouTube, and that feeling that you're doing something changes the whole experience. And then you feel like you're actually making a difference, making the world a little bit better. And the things that bother you don't bother you so much. Someone once said to me, don't try to change the world, just try to make a change in the world. And we try to focus on that every day so that we don't get frustrated or overwhelmed, and just know that we're making a change every day.
And maybe just bring us up to speed on an incident that you're looking at right now, just to give us a taste of what your life's like on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a very good, it's a good example. We were talking a little bit before for the rest of the panelists who don't know, and this issue just came up, and I mentioned it to Jonathan. Just about an hour ago, a tweet came out from B'Tselem, which is an NGO that's very critical of Israel, and in my opinion, not always 100% fair-minded. So according to the tweet, some Israeli soldiers in the north, I think it was Kiryat Shmona, had arrested some Palestinian children around the ages of 8 to 12 years old. And according to B'Tselem, they were just doing nothing but picking wildflowers. And there are these photographs that are very suggestive that it appears as if the IDF soldiers are acting overly roughly with these Palestinian children. So the question is, what can you say about that? And the answer is, well, of course, you got to reach out to the IDF spokesperson and find out if something happened. I know from past experience that sometimes terror groups do misuse children and abuse them and use them to carry out dangerous activities, which is a war crime, aside from being morally wrong and a form of child abuse. But I have no way of knowing if that's what's happening here unless the IDF can tell me why these kids were being arrested. So immediately, now this hasn't gotten into mainstream news yet, but my instincts based on a number of years of being here is that this story is the right kind of story and gaining the right kind of momentum that it probably will get into the news. And if I have nothing I can say about it, then that only one side of that story will be told, which is that the children were doing nothing but picking wildflowers. So I reached out to the people I know at the IDF spokesperson unit. I reached out to our managing editor and asked him to reach out to some of his contacts. Sometimes part of our job at Honest Reporting is to remind the Israeli authorities that there is a wider world out there, that physical security is not the only challenge we face, and that we do need answers on these things and we need them fast. And it's not enough for you to say we're investigating and then come up with an answer 3 months later. So right now, as we speak, my team is working on trying to get answers. So if this does end up hitting mainstream media, the answer won't just be the IDF have no comment, but rather the answer will be that B'Tselem said that kids were picking wildflowers, and according to the IDF, this is what was actually happening. If we can at the very least get that story out there, it changes the whole nature of the news articles that will come out.
Thank you for sharing that. Matty, one of the things, it's so good to be hearing about a current story because we get a taste of what the landscape's like. Now, you worked as an AP reporter for many years in the hot seat, and I also worked in news agencies. I know the speed at which you have to turn stories around. I know how complicated it is, how hard it is to discern truth from fiction, and pressures that you feel when dealing with editors, some of whom can bring bias into the decision making. Can you speak to what the current environment is like for working journalists on the ground, and some lessons that you learned from your experiences that you very much would hope that they would embrace, and something, Daniel, you may want to weigh in on this as well. And then I do have a follow-up question for you, Michal, which I'll get to in just a bit. But with you, Matty, please comment on the current situation.
Sure, although I must add that it's been a while since I've been a daily reporter. When I was working at the AP, it's a news agency, as you mentioned, so the turnaround time is very quick, and you're in competition with the other news agencies to see who can get the story out first. 10 years ago, when I was an AP reporter, we're talking about 2011, from 2021, that seems like medieval times in terms of media, right? We used to complain about only having 500, 600 words for a news story. And now, 500 words is like the Bible, you're supposed to do it in 280 characters or whatever it is. So often the bias is a bias towards simplicity. It's towards stories that are easily understood, towards stories that can fit into 280 characters. And often Israel's case, when it's right, and it's not always right? Often Israel's case is wrong. But when it's right, it's often very complicated. So if you want to understand, the Israeli position in the West Bank, for example, or if you want to understand why there is a conflict between Israel and the Arab world, if you want to understand why there isn't really an Israeli-Palestinian conflict that exists in a vacuum, but rather a much broader conflict involving dozens of actors across the Middle East, none of that fits into a tweet. And none of that can be written in 30 seconds when you have to get out, a 3-sentence news alert to beat Reuters, and these days it's not to beat whoever the other guy is on Twitter. So the other side really has a much simpler story, right? You see a scary looking soldier grabbing a Palestinian kid, right? That looks really bad, and it might actually do that. I'm not sure exactly what the circumstances were. That's a very simple picture that hits people in the gut. It speaks to that concern with rights that Michal mentioned, which is of course a very a well-meaning concern. And then, Israel has to get back with a long explanation about why the Israeli military is in the West Bank and what it's trying to do there and what happened in 1967, and the conflict predates 1967, and what would happen if we pulled out, and things might be worse if we pulled out, and that's all way, way too long. So often the need for speed and the need for a fast turnaround, the competition between different news organizations for a resonant, simple, powerful, punchy story, that often dictates what's going to be reported.
I think I could add something to that a lot of what journalists will often rely on is the concept that we call narrative. You already know the story you want to tell, then you take whatever facts just happened today and fit it into that pre-existing story. And if I could take this opportunity to say something that I really admire about Menachem Begin, he was saying in the 1950s, and it's prophetic that he was saying this back then, that he was saying that nationalism, the idea of believing in a nation and being proud to be a part of it, is not antithetical to liberalism. And also that national security is not antithetical to the idea of human rights. And in fact, he spent much of his career fighting for Israel to balance these concepts. And now, really in the last decade or so, it's become very strong in the international narrative that this idea that you are either in favor of nationalism or liberalism, that you either believe in national security or human rights, but it can't be both. And because Israel is a country that was based on Jewish nationalism, and because Israel is so constantly involved in national security issues, it's very easy for Israel to get caught up in a narrative as being illiberal and not respecting human rights. And our challenge is to make sure that we pierce that narrative and tell the real story of the complexity of what Israel is, and encourage journalists to grasp and share that complexity despite the pressures that they're under.
Good point, Daniel. And of course, there's the converse narrative of the Palestinians and the Arab nations surrounding, who often are backing their position, not only within the news media with their respective reporters, but also in international fora. Something that Michal alluded to in terms of mentioning the ICC. Michal, I'm wondering, Matty and Daniel have weighed in on the current situation. You have been sitting in the Knesset as the Abraham Accords have been signed, and what appears to be at least a better environment geopolitically. I'm wondering if that has really had much in the way of an impact on your work as you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee and deal with defense issues and other concerns, in terms of perceptions of Israel and your policy making. Again, more specifically, speak around the Abraham Accords, and if there has been any sort of reverberation of a positive nature to help change things, to try to bring some sort of balance into the picture.
So I'm sorry, I actually fell off and I missed that regard. I'll say that the potential that the Abraham Accords actually reflect, as far as I'm concerned, so the move away from rejectionism to normalization, I often describe it as the pivot away from the three no's of the 1967 Khartoum Conference: no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation, no to peace with Israel, to the three yeses: yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, yes to peace, in that order. And I think that the tremendous opportunity, again, it's up to us to realize the tremendous opportunity in this paradigm shift, or the potential paradigm shift, inherent to the first stage being recognition, i.e. recognition of the state of Israel to exist as what it is, Jewish and democratic, what it was founded to be according to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, Jewish and democratic, not democratic state of all its people, not Jewish halachic state. The state of Israel is Jewish and democratic. Inherent to that recognition, which then sort of paves the path to negotiation, enabling prosperity and peace and long-term sustainable future relations and so forth, that is actually the historic time that we're living in terms of changing the narrative with regards to the Palestinians, actually, with regards to all peoples in the region, providing that paradigm shift is understood deeply as what it is, reflecting, that first step of mutual recognition. It sounds very basic, But if you think about it, the reason that it's a paradigm shift is we were told you got to make peace, and then we'll negotiate the details of it, and eventually we'll come to recognition. But really, mutual recognition is the first step of the enablement of a change in relations between any two countries, or between peoples and a country, in that case with Palestinians, or with other peoples in the region. And I differentiate peoples from leadership in that sense. I think that it actually harbors the possibility to, first of all, enable the voices of moderation that have enabled or come forward in 4 peace agreements. And what we see in those countries, very interestingly, is, for example, the adoption of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism in Morocco, in Bahrain. Those are fundamental changes in understanding or recognizing not only Israel as a country in the region, but Israel as a Jewish country in the region. And I think those pave the path to a little bit to what I heard, just the tail end of what Daniel said. The imperative and the understanding that we have to engage, I would say, affirm international law and engage with exposing where international law and human rights, when they are undermined in the way that they are implemented. So if they're implemented with double standards towards one country, actually what we see is an engagement in enabling a continued culture of impunity to terror regimes in the region. Terror organizations in the region, but also beyond. It is the tremendous sort of the Abraham Accords as we see them. Of course, their name attests the shared values that they represent and so forth. But ultimately, it also demands and brings with it a tremendous responsibility for us to engage in that discourse, to engage with public opinion in a way that Matti does, in a way that Daniel does, in identifying the stories that, whether it's B'Tselem or other organizations, by the way, Matti referred to it, and so did Daniel, NGOs, often NGOs that are actually accountable to international law. And when we make accessible to those countries that they may be funding organizations.
Michal, unfortunately, your signal is breaking up.
They don't want funding, or organizations that undermine international legal principles in the way.
Michal, your signal is breaking up quite a lot. So if there's a way to get closer to your router or something, or open the door or something, it'd be terrific. I'm going to throw to you, Matty, in the meantime, while we try to figure out what's happening with Michal and the signal. You write your op-eds for the New York Times, and I'm curious to know what it's like, because when you write an op-ed, you're opening yourself up to attack from people who, Americans in this case, and other people around the world who read the Times. What happens to you now? What's the climate like in terms of Israel and some of the positions that you take? And, let's be honest, there is another narrative here. There's the Palestinian narrative. Many legitimate concerns that they have, obviously. We don't, unfortunately, have representation today of Arab journalists among us, or Arab members of the Knesset. But you take controversial positions, presumably. What happens to you?
Nothing too bad. I try to, in my journalism in general, I try to portray a complex country, and much of my writing about Israel is critical. If you read the 3 books that I've written about Israel, each in its own way is quite critical of the state of Israel from different angles. I'm Israeli. I've been here since I was 17 years old, and this is my country, and part of my job, a big part of my job as a journalist, is to criticize it. That's the way it works. What I find myself doing in the kind of world of the international press is trying to fill in the holes in the coverage that most readers are getting. So they don't need, I think, more coverage like 99% of the other coverage. They need interesting stories from the margins of the country that say something big about it. They need a fuller portrayal of the country that will kind of expand their sense of the place, which is subject often to kind of character assassination. And people are being given a picture of this place that's that's largely false. And I'm saying that as someone who's always been on the left side of the Israeli political spectrum. I, of course, have great respect for Menachem Begin, but I would never have voted for him. And I wouldn't vote for his successors in the Likud party. So I'm not coming at this as someone who's from the right. I feel like many Israelis do, that the country has been misrepresented and that the amount of international attention that's paid to this place is kind of unhinged. And the nature of international attention to Israel is negative to a degree that makes almost no sense if you're trying a rational attempt, if you're making a rational attempt at understanding planet Earth. So I've tried in my writing balance that out to some extent, and I think the New York Times, to its credit, has been very happy to take what I've given them. They've never rejected anything that I've written. The paper takes certain stance, but there's a pluralism of opinion that's there that they seem to value, and I hope that continues.
And what about the public itself? I mean, you're writing for the New York Times, but you're writing for the readers. What sort of feedback do you get? It's interesting because, of course, you're going to be pointing out inequities about Israel, and at certain times you're going to be perceived by many people as being pro-Palestinian in your perspective, because actually what you see happening within that camp is actually closer to the truth, or something that troubles you deeply. Do you get much ire? Are you getting a good receptiveness? Anything worth noting here?
On social media, you get a lot of kind of poisonous responses. I've learned to basically ignore it. There's just no point in getting involved with it. I make a rule of not really responding to any negative comments. Anytime you write something about Israel, you're going to get a lot of negative blowback because of the nature of what I've been writing over the past couple of years. The blowback tends to be more from the kind of the anti-Israel side, which is quite energized and very kind of aggressive. On occasion, when I was at the AP, it came from the other side. I got a lot of hate mail from pro-Israel types. I was writing a different kind of story. The story hits a real emotional button for people, and it doesn't behave like other news stories. For example, when the Russians invade Crimea or Ukraine, security does not have to be increased at Russian Orthodox churches in Paris, right? Russian academics in America aren't boycotted. There's no anti-Russia boycott. When Turkey acts against the Kurds, there's no boycott of Turkish academics. But when Israel acts in Gaza, synagogues in Paris and London and Montreal have to be secured, because there's a response to this conflict that is unlike the response to any other place or any other news story on earth. And that's one reason to be very, very careful with it if you're a journalist. But it's clearly hitting people on a different level than a story about Russia or China or France or Poland or the United States. It's a story that operates on a different level for people. It hits a really deep button, and it brings out a lot of very deep emotion, and it brings out a lot of potential violence. So you need to be really careful with the way you handle a story like that. And unfortunately, I think many journalists have been extremely careless with the way they've handled this story.
I'm going to come to you in a second, Daniel, about the current format in which journalism is conducted these days. But Michal, I had a question for you about the diaspora, and whether you've seen a change in perspectives from Jews around the world in terms of the conflict. We spoke about the Abrahamic Accords. Maybe there's something worth noting here in terms of perceptions. If you could speak to that. And I just want to remind everybody watching this that Paul Gross is a lovely guy, and he is monitoring the chat. And if you have a question, you should throw it in, because he would love to try to get your question in. So please use that format to relay questions, because we certainly want to get as many voices in here as we can. So Michal, can you speak to the diaspora?
Absolutely. So I'll say that, first of all, as a member of the Aliyah and Klita Committee, so the Immigration and Absorption Committee, I was very fortunate to launch and become chair of the subcommittee on Israel diaspora relations. And what was very important what is very important about that committee, and sadly it's an outgoing Knesset, but what was very important about it is engaging in discourse with diaspora communities, actually, as COVID-19 challenges all of us in places that expose probably what has been brewing below the surface, and some of it has already sort of, shown itself above surface. But in terms of Israel-diaspora relations, what that looks like is very often a growing gap in our realities and in our perceptions, affected both by, public perception of Israel beyond the Jewish communities, but also Israel's perception or lack thereof of diaspora challenges of the various communities, around the world that we engaged with. What was very important to me actually was to bring the communities into the Knesset, whether it be, students combating campus anti-Semitism around North American campuses, or the Jewish community of Bahrain, bringing communities into the Knesset so that my peers, my colleagues, other MKs are actually exposed to what is, or what are the challenges as those communities are experiencing them, maybe under the guise of COVID-19 challenges, but really, as I said, COVID-19 not inventing anything, but rather maybe shining a huge spotlight on everything that we should be aware of in multiple ways. And some of it are, immediate sort of the implications on education and on security, and actually COVID-19 also unleashed a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism around the world. So COVID-19 turned into COVID-48 very quickly on online anti-Semitism. And in that committee, I actually held 4 hearings on online anti-Semitism, the imperative to combat online anti-Semitism, and engaged Twitter and Google and Facebook and TikTok on what they're doing in order to combat online anti-Semitism, which of course doesn't only remain online. We know that the boundaries are very, very blurred, and what the experiences of the communities are. And actually, as we speak, we see the effects of actually the quarantines or the closures. Actually, as they open up, they lead to inevitably the translation of online anti-Semitism to finding offline manifestations in various communities around the world. I do believe that Israel at 72 has a very important responsibility to begin engaging diaspora in a very different way. And if I spoke about paradigm shift before with regards or vis-a-vis the Abraham Accords, there is a very important relationship paradigm that needs to be challenged in Israel-diaspora relations in the way that things have always been in terms of our understanding of our shared project. I would say our shared project was to build a country, and we did. And the question is, do we have a shared project as this country that we built, turns 73 this year? And assuming we have a shared project, what is it? How do we align ourselves as a people around the world with a diaspora that's, sort of as large as the population of Israel, certainly North America, but around the world with smaller communities that are not less important? And how do we engage, and how does Israel take responsibility for not only being the nation state of the Jewish people, but actually, I would argue, the responsible party for where Judaism is headed as we, sort of overtake, all the other communities, Jewish communities in the world, and have a responsibility to that as well. We just saw, the Supreme Court rule on non-Orthodox. Really, if you look at it, it was really not such a consequential decision. It was a decision that for 20 years, or the better part of 20 years, non-Orthodox conversions have already been accepted. This is what's called hop conversions. So this just prevents Israelis from having to go abroad in order to have a non-Orthodox conversion and be able to, in a civic, sense, utilize or make aliyah based on the law of return. And yet we saw the pushback, and we saw the tremendous need that imperative for us to engage in this discussion of what it means and the implications of not having this conversation between Israel and diaspora Jewry, as we sort of maybe think that we can just leave status quo as it is, or sweep this under the rug and say we'll deal with it some other time. This is it. The time has come, and these are issues that are festering and need to be dealt with in that sense between Israel and diaspora. And I truly hope that in that historic sense of, we spoke about the Abraham Accords, this also becomes a historic time that we take responsibility for those conversations as well.
Daniel, we talked about you being at the front lines of perceptions, and your organization exists because, as Matty rightly pointed out, people really take sides in this conflict to such an extent like no other conflict. Do you see any change at all, or is the intensity such that your job really, there's no difference between 6 months ago and today, really nothing's happening on the ground. And sadly, I mean, I'm not trying to put you out of a job, but sadly, you're going to be doing your job for years to come. How would you assess the current situation and what you look at when you look out at the future?
You know, we see changes all the time. The problem is that one thing will change and a new thing will come up. For example, there was a time when these clashes, attacks on the Gaza border were universally called protests by the press. And we made an effort to we constantly were speaking to journalists, and I'll give the New York Times credit. There's always a lot to critique the New York Times for, but in this case, I'll give them credit. They were one of the first major publications to begin using the phrase violent clashes instead of protests in their ongoing style guide. And we just recently got access to a tool that allows us to track big data across the web and news feeds. So we can look at hundreds of thousands of articles at a glance and see trends and graph them out. So for example, we saw that when Israel first started its vaccine drive, 60% of the news stories were mentioning this topic that Israel is doing great on vaccines, but not giving those vaccines to Palestinians. Now, there are a number of problems with the way that story is framed, and I won't go into that now unless you want me to when we have time. But I will say that we worked to change the narrative. We put out the more nuanced story, and we found, and I don't know if we can take credit for this, but I just know what the trend showed was that after several months, the percentage of stories mentioning Palestinians when talking about Israeli vaccines had dropped from 60% to about 7.5% of total articles being published every day. And so we see these changes all the time, but there's always a new event. And as Matti was pointing out, it's always easiest for journalists to grab onto a story being fed to them by an NGO or a narrative they already believe in. And then boom, suddenly we have a new issue to deal with and work with. My hope would be if we could reach a point where journalists would begin to learn with the level of depth of a doctor or a biochemist or a physicist before jumping into a new area where they don't know about, but the business doesn't seem to allow that very easily. And sometimes it's lack of resources and time. And as Matti alluded to, sometimes there is some ill will. People come in with a not so nice meeting agenda. That does happen, not most of the time, but it does happen too. So we work with all of it, and we do constantly see the needle move.
Now, your region is so small. All of you are sitting in Israel, and the Palestinian side of this narrative is literally just a few kilometers away from you. And Daniel, there are your counterparts within Palestinian society that look at Israeli coverage or foreign coverage and do exactly what you're doing, trying to whack back at what they say is bias. I'd like to hear from you how that looks from where you're sitting. Maybe there's an anecdote or two that you could share with us along that will help elucidate what that's like for you. And Matti, I'd like to have you chime in, if you could, on Palestinian journalists. There have been Palestinian, Al-Quds, I think that publication has been around for more than a century, is probably my guess. And there's a robust Palestinian radio and TV and print across the board. And then you have the Arab press overall. Comment on what that landscape looks like and how that's affecting perceptions of Israel. And then I'll get to you, Michal, but we got a lot there.
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that Israel's a country with free speech. And as the old expression goes, you take 10 Israelis, you get 12 opinions. And that's very true. Matti knows it from working in journalism, and Michal definitely knows this from working in Knesset. The Palestinian society is not a free society. It doesn't have free speech. People live in fear of their lives. People are disappeared. I say that as a verb, disappeared and tortured and killed. And when we talk about the Palestinian narrative, we're not talking about the narrative of a diverse, free-flowing Palestinian society. We're talking about the narrative of the Palestinian government. And what I believe is the greatest tragedy in the world is there are very few people out there standing up for Palestinians, not for the Palestinian government, not for the official Palestinian story, but for the Palestinians who cannot speak up for themselves for fear for their lives. When we talk about narratives, that has to be a part of the conversation. Who is really standing up for real Palestinians and for their basic human right to be able to engage in free speech?
And then Matti, from if you could speak a bit about Palestinian journalists and your observations about their work. They obviously are reporting to a certain viewpoint, and how that impacts not only perceptions of Israel, but actually the ability to get closer to a world in which journalists actually report closer to the truth, irrespective of what camp they come from.
I can't claim to be an expert on the Palestinian media scene, unfortunately. I've had the pleasure and honor of working with Palestinian journalists in the past, particularly when I was at the AP, and some of them were incredibly brave, particularly a reporter we had in Gaza. He had to deal with, everything that was going on between Gaza and Israel, and also everything that involved, everything that it meant to have a Hamas government, which was certainly not interested in, allowing free criticism and freedom of the press. The Israeli journalism world is incredibly critical. So being an Israeli journalist means being critical, and often being an Israeli journalist has always meant basically being on the left and critical of the right. That's just typically been the social scene of Israeli journalists. So if as an international outfit you hire Israeli journalists, what you're going to get is not people who are going to toe the Israeli government line. You're going to get people who are very critical of the Israeli government line, who are going to be very happy to provide critical coverage. The same is not true on the Palestinian side, not because there's a difference in ethics necessarily, but because people, as Daniel said, are not operating with the same freedom. They're more likely to toe the official line, whether because they believe it, because they believe that their job is to stand up for their people in the international press, or because they're afraid, and often they're afraid with good reason. So they're not, as Daniel said, those are not two parallel examples, the Israeli world and the Palestinian world. The world of Israeli Arab media is also very interesting and different. But again, I'm not enough of an expert to comment on it with any kind of expertise.
Michal, just to wrap up on this perspective from the Palestinian perspective and Arab perspective, inside the Knesset, you have fellow Arab members of Knesset, and let's face it, 20% of Israel is Arab. And certainly you're in a neighborhood with a lot of Arabs. Can you speak to this topic from your perspective?
Sure. I think that, again, we're at a time of tremendous opportunity because the voices of the leadership in Knesset, and we have to ask ourselves this, with regards to the three yeses, that first yes to recognition. The voices currently representing that 20% Arab minority in the state of Israel, many of them do not accept the state of Israel as Jewish and democratic. They do sort of declare their support for Israel as a democratic state of all of its citizens. Now, those are not the foundational principles of the founding state of Israel. Is why, despite that, they do sit in Israel's Knesset. But where I think the tremendous opportunity is right now, specifically with regards to Israel's Arab population, is that there is, I would say, a gap. By the way, not just in I would argue in the Arab public, but in other publics as well within the state of Israel. There is a gap between the population and the people representing it in Knesset. And I would argue that it is our opportunity and responsibility to actually empower the voices of moderation, meaning there are many Arab voices within the state of Israel, recognizing Israel as what it was founded to be, a Jewish and democratic state. Along the lines of the Declaration of Independence, actually, one of the first bills that I proposed is the Basic Law Declaration of Independence, because it's all right there, ensuring equality to all of its minorities, to all of its citizens. And we would be remiss if we did not identify that opportunity and reach an extended hand out to those possible representations or representatives of the voices that actually, what I called before, the power of moderates. They really transcend difference. And I'll tell you, I had the opportunity to chair the Committee on Use of Drugs and Alcohol. Seemingly nothing to do with anything that I came into Knesset doing. But I want to tell you that actually it was of the most important experiences that I had. It is, in my opinion, one of the most important committees in Knesset. I actually chose to identify the issues that we dealt with in the committees through the issue of addiction in general, and not just to those specific substances, but addictions very generally, addictive behaviors, addictive substances. And my colleagues around the table were from the Haredi, or the ultra-Orthodox party, from Shas, and from the Joint Arab List. And so I would walk around every single Sunday with Mansour Abbas, Yoshua Baruchi, and Yossi Tayyib, roaming the country in order to do our job in that supervising role. And the Knesset committees are far less covered by the news, because actually that's where the work is really done. It's not in the plenum, but in the committees themselves. So beyond our legislative role and legislative capacity, the important role of committees to supervise the executive branch, all the ministries and all the organizations, in this case, that have to do with addictions, were an incredible opportunity to transcend political or any other religious or ethnic divide and actually collaborate. And that's where the real work is done in Knesset. And so it is really important to know that this was not a perfectly functioning Knesset, far from it, and it only functioned for too short a while for this to be the sort of example of what can be done despite those differences. But it is something that happens in Knesset despite the huge ideological gaps. And I would say we are, in that sense, living in a truly historic time where it is imperative to integrate Arab representation that does accept the state of Israel's right to exist as what it was founded to be, Jewish and democratic, and include those voices around decision-making tables in the Knesset and beyond. I think we would be remiss if we didn't recognize the opportunity inherent to what we see around us. By the way, when although there was COVID-19, of the tens of thousands of Israelis that visited the UAE when the Abraham Accords were signed, are tens of thousands of Arab Israelis. And that speaks volumes to the potential in this paradigmal shift.
Looking at the zeitgeist, and I want to wrap up my questions here and open it up to everybody listening in here, and Paul will happily field those questions. I'm just wondering, in this digital age, Daniel, are things getting worse or better from your perspective in terms of news media and how it impacts public opinion and policy?
Yeah, that's a question. The good part about social media is we can directly reach people. The bad part about social media is so can everybody else. But conventional media still has a very big role to play, because a lot of the discussion you see on social media platforms begins with a news article that gets widely disseminated, and the discussion flows from there. In a way, it's made things harder because the news has a tremendous amount of pressure on them to be competitive with other outlets, to be fast and to be short, and to work on lower budgets. On the other hand, it does make it easier to fact check, to rebut, and to get other information out there, and to encourage other people to check that information. So it's a little of both. But, we worked with a consortium of a number of organizations, and also with Michal in the Knesset, to convince Facebook for the first time to pass a rule saying that that Holocaust denial actually violates their terms and conditions and won't be permitted on their platform. We also worked with a number of organizations to get Louis Farrakhan's 4th of July speech removed from YouTube, which was a horribly anti-Semitic speech. So we do find that as we reach out to these social media giants on a human level, to the people who are in decision-making capacities, and use the power and prestige of, for example, a member of Knesset or an NGO like ourselves, we are able to open lines of communication and convince people on a human level to do the right thing.
And Matty, do you think the noise is controllable? I mean, when you were working for the AP, of course, and we spoke about the speed at which you had to turn stories, now the information is coming fast and furious, quicker than even what you and I would have dreamt of in our days running around with the agencies. Where do you see this going, and the ability to get closer to the truth? Do we have a fighting chance?
I think that's two things are going on. One is that the sources of information are being democratized at an incredible pace, and there's just every possible kind of information available at any given time, and you'll find what you're looking for. And people, as Michal was talking about, people kind of live in a silo of information, and that's increasingly happening. the same time, what I see, at least among people who I know, is that the craziness is such that people are drawn back toward outlets that they think they can trust. So there's so much kind of nutty stuff around that people will go to the New York Times. They will, seek out the Washington Post, and they are going to trust that, brand, CNN. The old brands, they're eroding, it's true, in this kind of blizzard of, kind of wild information, but they still are very, very important, because I think that people still sense that information at those places is going to be better than what they're going to find just randomly looking on Facebook. So that makes the legacy players still important, less than they were 10 years ago, when I was a daily reporter, but they're still very, very important, even as we head into this kind of unknown age of, information that's impossible to verify, playing to every ideological, proclivity known to man.
I'm going to throw off to Paul here, because he has so many questions from the audience. So Paul, without further ado, go at it.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Okay, so we've had some really good questions. I'll start with this one. It's actually a few people have asked questions on this theme, which is really asking how do you explain the way in which some journalists and reporters are sticking to a narrative which is hostile, antagonistic to Israel, even in the face of information being out there which contradicts their narratives and other things? Is it, as is often accused, simply down to anti-Semitism? Is it something else? I don't know who wants to take that first. I think you're probably all very well qualified to answer. Maybe Matty could give it a go.
Sure. I hope we have 3 or 4 hours to have that discussion. I'm sure the crowd will stick. Often, I think it's a desire for a simple story with good guys and bad guys. That's what people want. Not many people are in it for the complexities, the last 100 years of conflict, the Sykes-Picot agreement, the build up to the '67 war, the role of Iran. People want a story about someone who's good and someone who's bad. They want someone to feel sorry for, and they want someone to hate, and they want a story that somehow channels their ill feelings about their own society. That's very important. What a lot of Western consumers want is not a story about a foreign place, because foreign places are too confusing and who cares about them. They want a story about themselves. So they want a foreign story that somehow tells them something about themselves. What this story can offer, if framed right or wrong, as far as I'm concerned, is a story that hits on the big issue for liberal people in the West in the 21st century, which is inequality. It's a story about inequality in the way that it's built. That famous picture from the first Intifada of the Israeli tank and the Palestinian kid with the stone. We all remember that picture because it's impossible to forget. It's an incredible kind of crystallization of that idea of incredible power versus weakness. And I can run around in circles explaining that, the guy in the tank is actually a very small ethnic minority in the Middle East. And actually the driver of the tank is the grandson of Jews who were run out of Iraq by that kid's cousins. But that's, far too complicated. And you've already been punched in the gut by this incredibly emotional depiction of inequality, which I think many liberal people in the West quite rightly believe to be the animating issue of the times. People in the West feel too powerful. They feel, that there's this incredible inequality in the world, and some people are incredibly rich, and some people have, malls and high-tech drones and tanks and nuclear submarines, and other people don't even have enough, food to eat, and they need to somehow channel that emotion into a story. And one of the reasons that the Israel story is so powerful is that it does exactly that. It's kind of a way of processing complicated emotions about inequality by presenting kind of a perfect victim and a perfect villain. And in the Israel story, unfortunately, the villain is us. The story is basically a fiction. It's just constructed by tricks of framing and chronology and emphasizing some things and not emphasizing others. But it is incredibly powerful and effective as we see as time goes on. So there is much else going on in the story, and the role of Israel and Jews in it, of course, is not coincidental. And I've written about that a bit, but it just might be a bit too long to discuss in the current format.
I just want to repeat what you said, because that was such a deep comment. People want to hear a story about themselves. That's some words to remember.
Right. Often we get involved in kind of explaining well, go into these very detailed explanations about history and numbers, but often that misses the point. People want this story and they're going to get it, and it really doesn't have that much to do with what we do in Israel. I mean, much of what we do in Israel is stupid, and much of our policy is wrong. But even if it was perfect, and even if we had 100, beautiful Oxford-educated spokeswomen making our case, I'm not sure that it would really matter, because the story is driven by demand. People want this story, and if the Jews in the 30s had amazing spokespeople explaining why they were not, in fact, manipulating the financial markets for their own gain, it wouldn't have mattered, because the story about Jews manipulating financial markets has nothing to do with whether Jews are or are not actually manipulating financial markets. It's a story that helps explain something in the world. It's a way of understanding the world for stupid people. That's what conspiracy theories about Jews are. And in many ways, the Israel story is that, not in all ways, and not as written by all correspondents all the time, but it has assumed many of those aspects, unfortunately.
Maybe, Jonathan, if I could just add to Matti's very profound statement, as I look at the title of our webinar, it occurs to me that there's also a growing gap between the public perception of Israel and Israel's perception of the public. And so, and I think that the role of media, and even, if I think about, English-speaking media and Hebrew-speaking media here in Israel, you'd think you were reading, if you're reading the Jerusalem Post or Yediot, or, a Hebrew language paper, an English language paper, reporting about the same place, already things get lost in translation. Certainly when you have that sort of gap of Israel's perception of the public versus the public's perception of Israel, the gap just keeps growing and growing. And so there's a lot of room there for filling in the blanks. And as Matti said very profoundly, telling a story that is perhaps about, speaks to the reader, because it's a story about themselves and about, creating justice or intersectionality that, enables them to feel that they're fighting the good.
Michal, I think you've frozen on screen. So I just want to mention something, about this, because I'd asked earlier about the impact of the Abraham Accords and whether we could see, some glimmer of hope that the perceptions and the reporting might change because of that. And Paul, please chime in too from your perspective. But if the Arab Street actually began to look at Israel differently and begin to accept it differently in a more positive way, would that change things necessarily? Because, Matti, you raised the issue of, the 1930s and perceptions, and had there been a chorus of fabulously effective PR people from a Jewish perspective, it may not have changed things. What is it going to take to change perceptions? Is the Arab Street being converted, as it were, over to a side that accommodates the Jews in the region, gonna have a huge impact? Or are we going to face a situation in which we are dealing with this problem? And what tools can we use to try to combat it? I mean, I'm asking the question, and I have some thoughts about it, but I do want to hear from you guys. And then, of course, Paul, we should get back to other questions.
I mean, my understanding is that certainly in the UAE, the Arab Street is very curious and interested and excited about Israel. My sense is that Bahrain may be a little bit less so, but there's still a great deal of curiosity. Egypt and Jordan still have what we'd call a cold peace, and so it hasn't hit the street as much in those countries, although I think there is a greater amount of curiosity and fascination with Israel than we often realize. I really don't have any information about Sudan and Morocco, which are other Abraham Accord countries, but certainly it's not one-dimensional. And I was recently on a really hostile interview on RT television, and the host said to me, well, the Arab Street is completely against us. I said, well, based on what I'm hearing from friends, many of whom are journalists who have been traveling, that's not the case. And he said, so then you're ignoring the Arab League's condemnation of the Abraham Accords. I said, well, the Arab League did not condemn the Abraham Accords. The countries in the Arab Leagues are the ones who signed the Abraham Accords. So I'd say, while I can't speak to everyone on every Arab street, there certainly is not the kind of one-dimensional quality that we've had in the past. There's complexity, and there's what you might call a thawing. Things are opening up and changing.
Right. RT, by the way, that's Russia Today. So that would be Russia's perception, or at least that journalist's perception of what reality is. Paul, let's throw back to you to pick up some more questions.
Sure. So we have a very specific question here about Qatar, and it might relate to a broader trend. But the questioner is asking about how Qatar deploys. He says that he just got off another Zoom meeting where he heard about how Qatar deploys info ops and influences various echo chambers through Al Jazeera and also more covertly via social media. And he actually specifically asked Matty, although if anyone else wants to chime in, please do. If Matty can address the question of how we can get unfiltered news these days. Do we need new mechanisms to get unfiltered news? Because if Qatar and maybe other bad actors, so to speak, are influencing news in this way, it's obviously a problem.
I wish I had an easy answer to that question. There's just one website to check and get good information. What I try to do is read a lot less daily news. I try not to follow the headlines that much. You can kind of drive yourself crazy by trying to figure out what's going on in a given day. And if you do that for a year, you'll realize at the end of the year that you're much crazier, but you've learned basically nothing. So I try to take that time that I would waste chasing bits of information on the internet, and I try to read books, not necessarily about Israel, but about Israel, if that's what you're interested in, and about anything. And I think that's probably a better investment of time than trying to chase headlines. When I follow journalism, I tend to look for journalists rather than publications, because there are many good journalists at publications that I otherwise don't care for, and vice versa. If I know, there's someone really good on Ukraine, someone who really gets that story, then I'll follow them. And I try to kind of pick and choose what I'm reading and who's writing it. You have to be a very discerning reader. There's so much that's bad out there. Some of it's ideologically motivated, some of it's active, disinformation, like the stuff that you're mentioning. Some of it's just misinformed and simplistic, and 90% of what's out there isn't worth reading. So the main challenge, I think, for a consumer of news right now, or for someone trying to understand the world, is actually knowing what not to read. That's the way to stay focused and sane, and it's tricky.
I'd add it's also about knowing how to read. Critical thinking is so important. Now, I'm a recovering lawyer. The first step is admitting that you are a lawyer. And then the next step, I guess, is going on to a second career. But I took with me what I learned. And there are certain very simple tricks that anyone can get the hang of that can make a huge difference. And one of my favorites is just read the article. Is it internally consistent? Or does the headline contradict something that the article says later on? If so, that's a clue that maybe you need to look at other things. Is the article making claims that don't have support? Does it use a lot of anonymous sources without saying why it's using anonymous sources? And then another thing is read a few different articles from a few different sources and see, are they all consistent or are they different? And if they're different, are those differences explainable, or does there seem to be something off? And that can start giving you a sense of when something's off and when to investigate further. And I'll echo what Matti said. We all have impressions about which news agencies we like the most and which we like the least. But look, maybe you like the Wall Street Journal and you hate the New York Times, but Bret Stephens was at the Wall Street Journal and now he's at the New York Times. So what do you want to make of that? There's different people working at different news outlets. There's really no substitute, unfortunately, for doing it the hard way. But I think in the long run, it's a more fulfilling way, because it's a skill that can serve you in any topic, not just Middle East politics.
And maybe I would just add, because everything's been said, but I would just add that actually when we consume news on our Twitter feed or on our Facebook, whatever it is, then we actually by definition are not challenging ourselves in the way that neither Daniel nor Matti alluded to. And I think that it's imperative that people recognize that we are actually being siloed in the way that we consume news, among other things. And what we do see is actually algorithmically designed for us to see, especially that. So I think it's very, very important that people start having that awareness. Actually, if anybody saw Social Dilemma, it begins to expose exactly that, but we're actually beyond that as well. And we can begin to use technology to identify and utilize technology in order to then combat that sort of identification or that siloed way that we consume news. possibly by holding, the digital platforms to account for the business model that they're using, but that'll be up to legislators. And, we're still in process with regards to that. We just saw what happened in Australia, with Facebook. I think that's going to be part of the pushback we see. Actually, the Interparliamentary Task Force that was formed with members of Parliament and Knesset from Israel, the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, and that I launched just after our own internal hearings in the Knesset, is very much dealing with a lot of these issues and how we address them, certainly from a legislator's perspective as well.
Okay, do we have time for one more question? Jonathan, is everyone okay to stay for one more question?
Yeah, definitely. Let's take in another one there, Paul.
Okay, so we'll do one last question. I think this one actually, perhaps all of you, including you, Jonathan, can comment on, because I think it's something that it's complicated, and I think you all have something insightful to say. So the question actually specifically asks about if you're all aware of the incident on Saturday Night Live a few weeks ago, where it was about the Israeli distribution of the vaccine, and the joke, so to speak, was essentially that Israel has given half its population the vaccine, and guess what? It's the Jewish half, was the punchline, right? And the question asks whether the questioner asks, or actually says, that there was a strong response from a large section of the Jewish community. Some people said it was anti-Semitic, and he himself said that he also had this strong response, but his adult son felt that that was an overreaction. And I wonder if we can broaden it out to this whole question of, when there's this sort of, I think, instinctive kind of feeling of like when there's something like that, where Israel, it's not just Israel is criticized, it's also there's something kind of mean-spirited about it, and also inaccurate, also kind of wrong in the reporting of it. Is there something that we really need to get very angry and upset about? Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, a prejudice? Or is it something that we should look at more, perhaps in a less serious way? Maybe everyone could comment on that.
I would love to touch that first, and happy to hear from the others. I find it reprehensible. I see it as a way to perpetuate stereotypes that do nothing but a disservice to everyone, including, in this case, the Palestinians and the Israelis, who really need to get around to settling their conflict and put an end to that type of position. It's very unfortunate. It's kind of freakish that was able to get through the editorial guidance of Saturday Night Live, and it's unacceptable and needs to be condemned outright. That's my perspective.
Thank you.
I'd say you've got to look at there's a general and there's a specific. If you want to look at the specific case, Michael Che, who was the comic involved, last May, he made a horrible joke about Hitler, or about Jews and Hitler. In 2018, he made just a series of horribly misogynistic jokes about women and their private parts and childbirth. The year after that, he made some awful jokes about trans people. And so this, coming specifically from Michael Che, I don't think there's any doubt that he intended that as being anti-Semitic. But in fairness to your adult son, who heard the joke and thought it was an overreaction, he's been hearing in mainstream press for the past several months that Israel isn't vaccinating Palestinians, and he doesn't have a sense of whether you're talking about people who are Israeli citizens or not. So he's coming probably thinking, well, Israel's vaccinating people based on their race or ethnicity or religion. And he could certainly be forgiven for believing that. Whether this joke or another joke like it is anti-Semitic or not, certainly it's wrong and it's untrue. It perpetuates a wrong story that leads to anti-Semitic acts. So I'd say that what the press reported led to an anti-Semitic joke, and all of that, both the joke and the press, these types of reporting lead to incidents like what Matty was talking about, which is a synagogue in Paris suddenly needing extra security because of what you saw in a newspaper. So the line between anti-Semitism versus just plain wrong is almost irrelevant, because all of it bleeds one into the other eventually.
And maybe I wanted to add to that, and one of the most important things when we want to address anti-Semitism is that there is a definition, actually, and we haven't referred to it. The IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, it was accepted by over 28 countries. It's a result of a 20-year democratic process, a consensus definition, a working definition, a resource, a tremendous resource, which can be adopted so that, when in doubt, we have a definition. Isn't that a great thing? And actually, we were able to engage, and you mentioned before that Facebook adopted a portion of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the piece about Holocaust denial. But in fact, when you need to combat something, when you address, you identify that there's a problem, you want to address it, you cannot combat it or address it without defining it first. And lucky for us, we have a definition. And the other thing that occurs to me very often when we talk about this, and the reason that we should respond or not respond, is not just about it being anti-Semitism. It's not just about anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism against Israel or against Jews. If you can't protect one minority, one religion, one country, ultimately you really can't protect any of them. And what we're talking about, as far as I'm concerned, especially with, we touched upon it in the, digital reality and the tremendous amount of misinformation or disinformation, is that actually anti-Semitism is probably just a predictive example of the significant misinformation and disinformation that we can find online. But it's a really good predictive example, which if we follow, and today actually as part of the interparliamentary task force that we formed, we have actually brought together the technological people that understand the technology that can track that hunch that anti-Semitism is but one predictive example of disinformation, and they can show it, right? So anti-vaxxing and anti-Semitism and white supremacy and QAnon, and they all intersect in the way that information is disseminated. And that's a very important resource that when we're able to track, in much the same way that the print press created a tremendous, on one hand, revolution and great opportunities, and on the other hand, there were definitely challenges to regulating how we consume, this new age of information. We are, with regards to the digital age, and we've been here before. We have the resources to create sort of regulatory systems. We just need to, do that. As legislators, we definitely need to give attention to how we do that in a way that, ensures that the public both, is guaranteed their safety on and offline, but is able to have access to information. And I actually don't like that binary free speech versus censorship. I think that there are ways to utilize the technology that exists to educate the public, right? To click out, so that when, teenagers engaging in Holocaust denial on TikTok, who don't know what Holocaust denial is, they don't even know what the Holocaust was, they can actually be clicked out, for example, be referred to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which includes, information, and reliable sources of information that enable the public access to information.
And Michal, you make a really good point that another aspect of that definition is holding Israel to double standards that you don't apply to other countries. And specifically on this vaccine, we did a big data study of the amount of coverage of servicing occupied populations in Russia with the Ukraine, Morocco with Western Sahara, Turkey with Cyprus, and China with Tibet. All of those countries had a grand total of 130 articles covering their servicing of their occupied areas since December 20th up until today. Israel had over 2,600. And so that is treating Israel by a double standard, which is resulting in all of these consequences. So the definition exists for a reason. When you engage in anti-Semitism, and I don't know if you mentioned, or if everyone noticed when you mentioned that this definition, it's not just something people came up with, it's been adopted by many countries in the world and many institutions in the world. This is the world's definition of anti-Semitism. And if it fits the definition, it is anti-Semitism. It's not like an impressionist painting that means whatever you want it to mean.
Matty.
I would just very, very, very briefly, I think that often by responding to things that don't necessarily deserve to be responded to, the Jewish community often inflates marginal stuff and kind of makes it worse than it needs to be. I have two, morons stand up with a sign at some event, and the entire weight of the Jewish community and sometimes the Israeli government will be employed, and it inflates these people and kind of gives them what they're looking for. And I think probably in the case of a joke on Saturday Night Live, it's best ignored or laughed at. It just that will probably make it go away faster. But I think that it is symptomatic of something real that's happened, which we mentioned earlier in the conversation, which is that Israel is being associated with the gravest sin of our times, which is inequality and racism. The worst thing you can be right now is a racist. And in the past, Jews have been associated with whatever a society considers to be the gravest ill of the time, right? So if you were an anti-communist, you believe that the Jews were Bolsheviks. And if you hated capitalism, then you believe the Jews were bankers. And if you were concerned with racial purity, then the symbol of racial impurity was Jews. And if you were a fervent Christian, then the anti-Christians were Jews. And it's, you can go on about it for hours. It's an old mental illness in Western societies, and not only in Western societies. And you can't help but ignore, even if you're a not particularly conspiratorial person like myself, and even if you tend to see the glass half full as I do, you can't ignore that what animates liberal society in the 21st century is racism and inequality. And the premier example of racism and inequality for many people has become the Jewish state. And it's so immediately recognizable that it works as a joke on network television in America. It's that Israel is racist idea is so familiar that it can actually serve as a punchline, and that is very worrisome.
Paul, how do you feel? Do you want to continue with this? Matty, it's a very important point, and it, something that you and I talked about in the past about perceptions of Israel and colonialism, which is at the center of a lot of Israel's battle for legitimacy and understanding within the world and among nations. But we've covered so much ground here. What do you want to do, Paul? One more question?
Well, I think we're at the hour and a half mark, so I'm inclined to say thank you to everyone and leave it for now. But I want to, if that's okay with everyone, I think we'll say good night and good day. But I'd be very happy to continue this in a future webinar, and you're certainly all more than welcome to come back. For that webinar. I want to thank Jonathan very much for so ably moderating and lending us his own great insights as well. Matti and Michal and Daniel, everyone should read Matty Friedman, get all his books, read his columns in the New York Times and elsewhere. Sign up to check Daniel Pomerantz's honest reporting website and sign up to the newsletter that they send out. Michal Cotler-Wunsh is very sadly not running in the Knesset in the elections that are coming, which I think you will all agree after hearing her this evening is a huge loss to the Knesset. But we should all follow her career, because I think she's going to be a hugely significant person and star of Israel in the future. I want to thank everyone again. My name is Paul Gross. You can email me paulg@begincenter.org.il. I put it in the chat box if you want to get on my mailing list and receive details in advance of all of these webinars and also other events that we do here in English. At the Begin Center, we have weekly events in English on Zoom at the Begin Center at the moment. So you'll get all that from me if you sign up to my mailing list, drop me an email. I can tell you that in 2 weeks, we have another webinar as part of this series, which is the part 2 of our webinar looking at conflict resolution. We'll be talking more specifically about Camp David Accords of 1979, which of course Menachem Begin signed, peace with Egypt, and going forward, the more recent normalization agreements of the Abraham Accords, which have been discussed today as well. So I thank everyone again. I wish everyone a good day and a good evening, and see you all very soon. Bye.